So, a lot of times people will write things and then they'll come back to it years later and find out that there were little changes to it, or they don't feel that way at all. So when I was going through your list of blog posts, I came across something from 2003. I want to see if you still feel that way. The name of the blog post was In Defense of Craft. And in it you really lay out the argument why craft is important. So I'd just like to give you a chance to talk a little bit more about that. First of all, why do you feel, well, maybe the better question is, what is craft?
What is craft? I remember when I penned that article, it was, I was teaching at the American College of the Building Arts. And so that gave me a lot of reflection because, I'm supposed to be some sort of authority on at least the particular craft that I was teaching, the traditional heritage plasterwork. And, I actually just looked it up etymologically, what were the root of the word craft? And craft, has a Teutonic origin, meaning like German type Germanic origins, and it really had to do with the idea of power, but like embodied power. So embodied power, and then with time it kind of had a more nuanced meaning that the embodied power reflected skill. So it was something to do with like the integrated person. So someone who integrated the power that is almost uniquely human, mental, intellectual capacities, but then somehow that gets embodied and manifested physically. So craft is the power of the integrated man, a woman, you could say. So.
Okay. Well, that's certainly not exactly the way we look at craft these days. That it does not have that definition. I'm assuming then that's why you feel like craft is something that needs to be defended?
Yeah, I think because a lot of times when we hear about crafts, it's like a hobby or it's something trivial. It's not serious. In a certain respect, it isn't serious. Is life serious, or is life playful? So, but it certainly isn't trivial. I'll give you an example. So, food, clothes, shelter. Maybe you could include medicine. I mean, these are like the basic building blocks of culture, of society. I won't even say civilization. Civilization is like a subset of culture, because culture has existed long before we had the idea of gathering ourselves into cities. So culture is something much, much deeper. And so with the word culture, you have words like cult, which makes you think of ritual and religion. We have a cultivation, and so that's literally the application of man's power and skill, his craft, in taking something from nature and nurturing it. So culture and cultivation and these ritual embodied actions that we repeat over and over again, where we both develop and manifest our skill, that integration of the intellect with embodied action that we actually carry out, it's actually what lies underneath mankind's early ability for agriculture, so for farming, for creating textile traditions, for clothing ourselves, which allows us obviously to expand into parts of the earth that otherwise, we're pretty fragile creatures as human beings. Otherwise, we couldn't live there if we didn't have clothing, and then shelter, architecture. So architecture is a result of, its basis, its foundation is that of craft, this embodied physical and intellectual integrated skills. So craft lies underneath basic of life. So when we become disembodied, when we become a society that's strictly almost living in our minds, and we're cut off from the ability to create our own food, clothes, shelter, medicine, we actually become disempowered. We become both dispossessed from nature, which is our inheritance, it's what we're part of, and we also become disempowered. We're losing our a fundamental part of ourselves.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, obviously I agree with that. In the article you mentioned, you took great pains to distinguish craft from labor. How would you want to expand on that a little bit more? You want to talk about the differences? Is one a subset of the other?
Yeah, if I recall, unless maybe my position has changed, I made it a point to say that craft, that was a misconception concerning craft, that craft is not labor, that it is just the intellectual aspect of labor. And so that's a misconception about craft. Yes, craft is labor. There is a very embodied physical aspect to craft. You know, you do get dirty, you do sweat, and you do all the things that you do when you were a child and loved.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like you're exploring the world through your body. And so, you know, the craftsman gets to keep that youthful part of themselves, you know, throughout their life. And so, yeah, there's actually no real separation between the two. Craft is labor, but it's not just labor.
It's not just labor.
Not just
right.
labor.
Yeah, no, I did see that, and you're absolutely right.
Mm-hmm.
It is listed under your misunderstandings that craft is not labor. So then what would you say, because we're living in a time now where it seems like every bit of technology is coming out to supposedly save us from labor. Obviously you don't feel that that's, judging from your article, that's not exactly how you feel that society should be going. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, who's decided that labor is, you know, is demeaning to the human condition, and that it's something that we need saving from? I mean, there's obviously types of labor that are like physically destructive to the human body, but you know, a lot of labor is not at all. So, you know, for example, step away from handicraft, but look at, you know, food cultivation, taking care of animals. You know, that's very laborious, and in Western society in particular, which is now becoming global society, has made the decision that nobody really wants to do that. But the people who continue to participate, even if it's something as simple as a gardening, they find great joy in cultivation. Getting back to those words, cult and culture again. So it's the same with handcraft. You know, through taking on something that is extremely challenging, is at the limit of human ingenuity and skill, at the level of the individual, that practice transforms the individual. So, so I think, you know, we need to be very careful about the things that we've been doing a very long time that got us to the point where we're at, and making a decision on a completely rational, disembodied intellectual basis that there are more efficient ways to do that. We don't need that anymore. Efficiency, unfortunately, is not a synonym for efficacy. And I think this is the problem of modern society, contemporary society, is that while we've privileged the abstract, we've privileged the intellectual, the mind, by letting the body go, we've become very literate, very numerate, in certain respects, but at the same time inefficacious. So efficacy having the meaning of being able to make, coming from that Latin root facere or facere, is to be able to make something, to bring something into existence. So we're becoming less creative, having less capacity to show our autonomy, to show our mental and physical power and skill as we become more passive and dependent on preformed ideas that are led by algorithms and or large institutions, whether it be the state or the corporate level. We become passive and dependent.
So do you see any viable intersection between craft and what we have come to know of as technology? And I say, actually, what we've come to know. Talk a little bit about technology and that word and where its origins and how it's changed.
Spoken about this before. Technology has Greek origins, and it comes from the idea of the techne, which was Greek word for craft. Particularly craft as it related mostly to architecture, either masonry or timber framing, something that would support the building up. And then the logia was the idea of the knowledge that took things from a chaotic state and then informed that and created order. So the knowledge that brings order out of chaos. So you combine those two. We're using our embodied knowledge. It's a type of philosophy. Philosophy is the love of knowledge, what the word quite literally means, and then I would say craft is the love of know-how. So it's also a type of love of knowledge, but not an abstract, strictly intellectual knowledge. It's the knowledge that is embodied, and it exists not just in handicraft, but it would exist, of course, in the things that we talked about, such as farming, such as textile making, but likewise, I think the dancers must experience this as well. Musicians, so they're achieving an understanding of the world through embodiment. So there's an intellectual part of music, putting things in order, putting sounds in order, of course, but that has to be effective, that has to be orchestrated through the body, and it comes through ritual. Again, you have the idea of cult there. So you do the practice again and again and again, and so the creative moment actually comes by a submission to a discipline over a long period of time, like learning your scales, practicing those chords again and again and again and again until they become essentially a part of you. And all of those things are at the limit of human capacity. We can do it, but it just takes so much years of practice to really master that. And so those are the preconditions for the creativity. And it's very similar for the craftsman. It's submission to material reality, submission to a discipline.
So then, do you, the question that I was going to ask you before about technology, the way that it is viewed today, do you see any intersection between where craft can benefit from technology without technology completely taking over and replacing craft, which is a lot of what we see happening now? Is there a place where craft can actually utilize technology and keep it in the place that it was supposed to be?
Craft is technology, and that's what
the modern version of technology.
Right. We're thinking more in terms of high technology, things that are require large capitalist infrastructure. They're proprietary in nature. They're not things that we can truly could create on our own or within a small community. Again, there's a certain incompatibility because those type of highly complex systems require passive independence and interdependence, and so It's not something that any one person can get their mind around. So, and also those systems tend to be, they tend to be very linear in nature. So they're not cyclic processes that we can necessarily return to at the level of the individual. So so it becomes very difficult to see if traditional means and methods, traditional craft is really compatible with the direction that we've been going, let's say, for the past 150, 200 years since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. We've established a lot of entropic paths that are dependent upon linear ways of thinking, the extraction of resources that are non-renewable. And we've had this cultural entropy at the same time. So we found the most efficient way of doing something, efficient from a certain point of view, and usually it discounts the idea of time. So we may think, we may think in terms of 5 years, 10 years, or even a generation, but we're not thinking in considering that fourth dimension of time over a long, extended period of time. And in many cases, we're not actually, we may think about ourselves, we may think as far as what's good for our family. We may even go as far as like what's good for our community, but then it becomes, in the contemporary way of thinking, we're not really necessarily thinking about a larger group of people, and then a larger group of people over an extended period of time, multi-generationally, and then we don't, certainly I very seldom hear that we're thinking about also considering ourselves a part of nature. So what's not only good for ourselves, our families, our community, and what's good for nature, but what's going to be good for those things over a long period of time. And so our traditional ways of doing things, in many cases, had those lessons embedded right in it. And so we were more tied, oftentimes, to a sense of place. And because you have those constraints, you worked within those constraints of what you had, and realizing that resources were not, unlimited. So craft is kind of was built upon man's integration, not only internally, as we've been talking about, but then also externally with his immediate environment and the resources that were around him.
Okay. Well, I guess one final question then is, what would you, what's a message that you want to give to students, to kids, to homeowners? What's like one key thing that is important to continuing craft that maybe not so much the philosophical aspect of it, though it's closely tied into it, but almost like what's a way for people to understand that this is important, this is not something that needs to go away, it needs to be brought back because it's important to our society. Is there any one thing that you would like to say or to focus on when you're talking to people?
Well, it's not something for someone else. It's your birthright. It's your culture. And so if it's disappearing, it's your culture that's disappearing. I mean, this is what your grandparents and your great-grandparents did, and it's where you come from. So, and not only do you have a right to it, but if you're, for example, if you're a parent, or even if you're just a teacher, the subsequent generations have a right to it as well. This is not something trivial that we're losing. This is very much at the root of what it means to be a human being. So
that's important. All right. Well, thank you.
Okay.